Great to see everybody. Great to be back outside with you all again. Hope I'm just looking around, make sure everybody's awake. Haven't dozed off in the sleep. I've seen a couple of nice rocker lawn chairs, and I'm waiting to see the feet kick up. And yeah. Hey, first of all, before we get going, just thank you to everybody who came out, had a great day yesterday, took part in that. Thank you for all who helped out with that. Thank you for those who, especially were here bright and early in the morning and probably didn't leave till later in the afternoon. Thanks to Fuzzy for putting that all together and engineering that. It really was a fun day of just kind of hanging out as a community together, celebrating, serving. For me, and I got to sit around the hot dog cart and just take in the fumes of hamburgers and kielbasa. So it was just a very special day for me. It was really good. But that's for me what it's all about, just serving and celebrating together as the church in the name of Christ alongside of our community. It's just a great thing. And we've got a lot of just really neat feedback, especially hearing from people, just on a heavy, somber day where we are remembering certain things that are heavy on our hearts. It was just neat to see the broader community all coming together and just having a nice time together and being in community with each other. So thanks for that. And it's a great day. Like I mentioned, there was a lot of kielbasa and hamburgers and hot dogs left over. So we're going to be having that going over here. I think Carl's going to be starting that grill going a little bit. So if you're able to pay attention even more with the smell of kielbasa just looming, Polish kielbasa from Port Richmond looming over it, man, kudos to you. So we'll try to move this along. Over the summer, if you've been with us, what we've been doing is we've been looking at a series, kind of take a break from our norm here, and just kind of looking at a series of really difficult questions or objections that people have with regards to Christianity, major sort of walls or hindrances to the ability to entrust themselves freely in faith to Jesus Christ. We've been looking at some of those hard questions. Today's the last Sunday in that. We start a new series next week, and actually another question entitled Why Church? I'm looking forward to that after a year or two of a pandemic messing with our lives individually, but also our life as a church. It'll be nice just to kind of circle back around and spend a few weeks talking about why do we consider this business of worshiping, of fellowshipping, of serving together in person to be just a core essential of life, especially life lived in pursuit of Jesus Christ, wanting to follow after him. So we'll start all that next week. Again, we're closing up our series on these tough questions with this last question this morning. How can you, spoken maybe from an outsider or somebody struggling to believe, how can you trust the Bible? Simple question. Yet it's a huge question. And as we've been saying each week, some of these questions are just massive and really hard questions. And we can't possibly answer all the nuances or come at all the different angles of these questions. In particular, let me say this, and what makes this question so challenging and so difficult is, you think about it. Think of our culture. We live in a culture today where, if you're anything like me, you are kind of cynical about our news sources these days, right? We live in a day and age where we doubt or we have a hard time trusting that our news and our information sources are not coming from positions of bias or sort of self-interest. We live in a day and age where we have coined this new term, fake news. Right? And so we live in this sort of, or we live in a day and age where oftentimes we get most of our information and our news from people sharing on social media, which presents all of its own challenges and struggles. So a lot of people are saying one problem we're facing as a culture is we're becoming very skeptical and cynical of information sources. And so as just living and breathing in that culture, how do we then turn to the Bible? And how do we trust this 2,000, 3,000-year-old book written by poets and peasants, by shepherds and doctors and fishermen and kings, right, from a totally different culture, from ancient Near Eastern culture? How do we trust this Bible that has stories of giants and floods and man rescuing whales and so here's what we want to do this morning, or here's how I'm going at this. I'm going to kind of zero in on the epicenter of the whole thing. And I'm going to zero in on what, if you ask me, is the most preposterous claim, or the boldest claim, or the most unique claim about the Bible and Christian faith. And that is this claim that comes out in this sermon from Peter in Jerusalem in Acts 2, that Jesus has been raised from the dead. Okay? And we're basically asking the question, how can you trust that? How can you trust this word from Peter that Jesus has in fact been raised from the dead? Okay, and I'm going after that in particular this morning because if you ask me, that's the epicenter of the whole biblical storyline. Everything before it is plowing forward to that moment. Everything after it is looking back at that moment. This is the epicenter of the whole biblical storyline of God who has this vested interest in his creation, coming to rescue and restore it. I'm zeroing in on this because, I think this question has the most implications. If you can't trust the word about the resurrection, you can discard the rest of the book, in my mind. Or like Paul would say, hey, if we can't trust resurrection, let's just eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Or on the other hand, if you can trust the word about the resurrection, well, now everything else in the Bible is now moved into the realm of possibility. And not only that, if you can trust this word about the resurrection, that really changes everything. It changes everything about your life. It changes everything about the way you even look at life, or you look at the world, or you think about what it is we're doing here. So that's why I'm going after this particular question. Can we trust this word about the epicenter of the whole biblical storyline, the resurrection of Jesus? And we're going to do it by talking through these selections from Acts 2. It's a rather long chapter. That's why we kind of had to condense it a little bit this morning. And here's how I'm approaching the chapter. I'm looking at Acts 2 as just all around a very, very strange scene. It's got a strange character up front. It's got a really strange message, and then it's got really strange results of this message being preached. And I'm looking at that strangeness all as evidences that this is actually a trustworthy message. Okay? So that's where we're going. Strange character, strange message, strange results. Just to give you a little bit of background on the book, that's why we read from chapter 1. This is Luke writing. Best we know, he's a medical doctor who followed around the Apostle Paul. That's our best guess. And he's writing a book to this guy named Theophilus, trying to give, it's actually part 2. He wrote the book of Luke, and now Acts is the follow-up. And it is an explanation, it's a detailed account with an explanation of all that Jesus did, all that happened to Jesus, and then all how that continued to play out in the life of the church. And here in Acts 2, part of what precipitates all of this is that you have all these people gathered in Jerusalem, people from all sorts of different ethnic backgrounds, all sorts of different languages, and all of a sudden the followers of Jesus are coming out, and they're able to declare this incredible news about Jesus and his resurrection, particularly to people with all different languages. And so there's all these different languages being spoken about in this great gospel, this great news going on. And everybody's asking, what in the world is going on here? And in part, this sermon that Peter is giving is meant to explain this incredible stuff that has happened that is leading to just this as one of the tangible outflows of this incredible message of resurrection. Okay? So first of all, first element of strangeness for me is the person who's delivering this address. Peter. Okay? If you know anything about your New Testament, if you know anything about the Gospels written right before this, you would know Peter is a very interesting character. All right? Among other things, Peter is a brazen screw-up. Okay? Right? Peter's the guy, he's very self-confident, he's very proud, and oftentimes leads him into these just monumental screw-ups. Right? Peter was the guy when they were out on the boat and they saw Jesus walking on the water in the midst of the storm. Peter says, hey, Lord, if that's you, call me to come out. I'll come out with you and I'll walk in the water with you. And Jesus calls him out and he gets out and starts to walk, sure enough, across the water. And then, he takes notice of the waves and the wind, and the storm, thunder and all that. And his faith wavers and he begins to sink and Jesus has to rescue him. Or it's Peter who gets one of the sternest rebukes in the whole New Testament, when he is misunderstanding the mission of Christ, the mission of the Messiah, and he's questioning Jesus on his mission and what it's going to involve. Jesus looks at him and says, get behind me, Satan. Right? Or most famously, it's Peter who, last time the disciples are gathered with Jesus for dinner, he says to Jesus, I'm with you to the end, brother. I'll never fail you, never betray you, never turn my back on you. And sure enough, it's only a couple hours later, a little girl comes up and asks him, hey, you know this guy that they just arrested, this Jesus? And nope, never heard of him. Another couple people come up and say, hey, do you know this Jesus character? No. Or do you know this Jesus character? A third time, and he starts cursing them. I'm telling you, I don't know this Jesus character, right? There it is. Thank you. There's the rooster. I love it. It's good to know somebody's paying attention over there. Right, so this is Peter. So here's the point. There was criticism that came out a few years back, maybe around the time the Da Vinci Code was coming out. There's a whole skeptical view on the New Testament and whatnot. And a lot of these people were saying, you know, the New Testament was written maybe 200, 300, 400 years after the life of Jesus. And it was written by a bunch of people who were trying to gain power in the Roman Empire. And so they wrote this religious message trying to, I don't know, win over the hearts and minds of the masses so that they could secure their own power and whatnot. And that's wrong. Well, that's problematic on so many levels. First, the historical timeline of the writing of the New Testament is terribly off base. But second of all, and more importantly, if that was your aim, if you were composing some sort of religious story and circulating that about to get people to buy into this religious system that you had crafted for your own personal gain or whatever, you wouldn't use Peter as the one to deliver that message, because Peter for sure would have had this reputation of a monumental screw-up. Right? It would have been like if you were, you decided you wanted to write a book on auto mechanics for the goal of becoming a celebrity speaker, podcaster, book writer about all things auto mechanics. And in chapters 4, 5, and 6 of your book, you decided to spend a whole lot of time quoting me on how your catalytic converter works. That would be just about the dumbest thing that you could possibly do, because if you know me, if you've ever seen me try to change the oil in my car, you would know that would just shoot the reputation of your book just like that, okay? In the same way, if you're trying to craft a story to win over the masses, you don't use Peter to do this. And yet the Bible's doing this all over the place. It's using guys like Peter, Thomas, who doubts and struggles in his faith. It's using women, actually, as the first testifiers to the resurrection in a day and age where women's testimonies were not counted all that credible. Which is all to say that for Luke, who's writing this, the only reason he uses Peter is because that's just the way it happened. Not to mention for Peter, the interesting thing about Peter is that Peter would know of all people that standing up in the middle of Jerusalem and proclaiming this message was not going to play out well for him. Again, he's the guy that just about a month or so ago was scared of these little girls and these people who are asking him questions because they knew that if he aligned himself with this Jesus in any way, then the authorities who were taking Jesus away were going to do the same thing to him. I mean, Peter probably knows that on the back end of this sermon, what's coming? He's going to wind himself up in jail. Right? Because in the middle of Jerusalem, if you start to identify yourself with Jesus and you proclaim this message that Jesus has been raised from the dead, well, you're going to run into the same trouble with the Jewish authorities that Jesus did. And if you go beyond that, even, and dare to say that this Jesus is Kyrios, is Lord, and Caesar is not, well, now you have the whole weight of the Roman authorities coming after you. Which is all to say there's nothing in it for Peter to do this. And if you know Peter's story, you know there never was. In and out of jail, and died most likely the same way Jesus did. Roman crucifixion. Maybe may or may not have been right side up. So that's the point. First thing is you have this strange character giving the message. There's nothing in it for him, and there's certainly nothing in it for the writer using Peter. Okay? Which leads to this first reason that not only for Peter, or not only for Luke is he using Peter because that's just the way it happened, but for Peter, the only reason that he would stand up and give this testimony is because in his mind and his heart, he's convinced this is actually what happened. All right? Strange thing number 2 is the actual message. That God has raised up this Jesus, loosing the pangs of death because it was not possible for him to be held by it. or this Jesus raised up, and of that we are all witnesses, and is also therefore exalted at the right hand of God. This is a really strange message. And let me put it to you this way, in the ancient context. My family, we've been living in Delco here for 5.5 years-ish. I love it. I love Delco. It's got so much pride, so much character. And I'm hoping one day, it's one of my life goals, that the local Delconians will welcome me into the tribe. We'll see if that ever happens. And part of the neat thing too, like I meet a lot of lifetime Delconians. I don't even know if that's the word, but I meet a lot of these lifetime Delconians who were born in Delco, went to school in Delco, maybe went off to college somewhere, but then came back to Delco to raise their family and to start their careers and whatever. And that's really interesting. It's kind of it's a little bit different because I came from Montgomery County, from Springford High School, and there it was a mark of you had made it in life, or if you graduated and you never came back, right? If you graduated and you moved on to bigger and better things, right? If you graduated and you went off to college and then somehow you wound yourself back up in Royersford, at least, you know, in my days, which I did, but they would say, like, why? Why'd you come back here? And if you ask me, I get it. In my personal opinion, Montgomery County doesn't hold a stick to Delco. Montgomery County is very... I don't even know how to describe it. Very tame. There's no character. Anyway, well, that's a whole separate issue. But here's the point of this. If you had gone around saying to folks in the ancient culture, hey, this Jesus whom you crucified has been raised from the dead and has come back to new life, the first question you might get in return might not be, hey, how can you prove that? More likely, it's going to be, why? Why in the world would he do that? Because in the ancient world, especially in the Roman culture, maybe not so much the Jewish culture, but definitely in the Roman culture, death, not such a horrible thing. It was sort of like the great liberation. It was the great escape. It was the moment when, in the ancient world, look, this broken world that we live in they consider it like this prison cell for for your soul. And so death was the great liberation. It was the great moment where your soul was able to transcend this body, transcend this broken, decaying creation, and drift off to some higher spiritual plane, some higher spiritual existence in some other place. So why in the world anybody would ever want to come back into a body, into this broken world? That would have made no sense to people. I'll tell you. Which is all to say two things. One, from day one, Christianity was always radically unique in its claim that this world matters. That, yeah, there is a brokenness to this world, but God has not given up on it. Christianity was always unique in its claim that said the Creator actually loves this place, that he made it teeming with life. He intended it always to be a place of beauty and joy and wholeness. And sure, it got all messed up. Sin and rebellion against the Creator enters into the picture, but this God has not given up on it. This God is committed to rescuing it, restoring it, to being this perfect home, not only for his people, but this perfect home where he can dwell with his people. That was radically unique in the ancient world. And that is what the resurrection is all about, actually. It's not this nifty little magic trick, but it's the epicenter of this story of God coming, which is another radical uniqueness of the Christian message, of the Creator God choosing to enter into, in love, this broken creation, and to suffer in his own body, in his own flesh, all that was not right, to suffer the injustice, to suffer the hatred, to suffer the betrayal, to suffer ultimately the pain of death, so that he might, in this really neat way, exhaust the power of evil and death and begin to flip all of that on its head and begin to start this great restoration renewal project, right? But again, the big picture is this is radically unique, radically distinct, kind of odd and strange. In other words, it wouldn't be the type of message, if you were trying to win over the masses to this new religious movement, you wouldn't necessarily use this, unless it were true. You wouldn't use this to try to sell the masses to your new religious plan. Which leads to that last part of strangeness. is that, you read Acts 2 and you look through the accounts of history, and that it is that the people do latch on to this. And they do buy into this in droves. And I think Luke says here 3,000 people come to Christ, join the church here in this moment. Both Peter and Paul and the New Testament writers, when they talk about the resurrection of Jesus, they'll say he was raised and he was here and he appeared to his disciples and he appeared to hundreds of followers, speaking to them about the kingdom, proving himself to them. So it's probably likely that there were people in the crowd who had some sort of encounter with the risen Jesus. And it's not till Peter comes and explains this that all of a sudden the lights go on. Oh, okay. I get what's going on here. And they're jumping on board in droves to this message, this strange message. And just bear with me, I'm a little bit of a history nerd here, but it's so interesting to me. Like, the strangeness of that, of 3,000 people who, by the way, life was not going to go easy for them because they're signing up for this. They're going to be ostracized from their community. They're going to lose jobs. They're going to lose family. Some of them are going to lose their lives for this, right? But the radicalness of that many people signing on to this message historically after the death of their Messiah is so weird. You can go do a Wikipedia search on first century Messianic claimants, right? People walking around during the time of Jesus claiming, no, we're the Messiah. There's a bunch of them, actually. You have shepherds who had a few brothers, and they would go and lead raids against, the Roman military regiments or whatever. You had charlatans that would go down to the River Jordan and say, hey, come with me. I'm going to part this water right here, just like we did back in Exodus. And and they would all claim to be the coming of the Messiah. Or you had a servant in the house of Herod who from the inside started to burn down some of the palaces and was kind of staging this revolt against the Jewish authorities. And then he would take the throne, the crown for himself, saying, I am the Messiah and I'm here to bring in God's kingdom. Well, you have all these people going around and doing this, and sure enough, they would grab a follower, but then sure enough, what would always happen is either the Jewish authorities or the Roman authorities would come in and they would squash this little movement. And they would always kill the figurehead. They would always kill this messianic figure. And then in every single instance, when the figurehead is killed, the movement would just kind of fizz out. The people would say, okay, clearly he wasn't who we thought he was. He didn't bring in the kingdom before he died. And it's probably not in our best interest to keep this whole movement going, seeing what the Roman authorities just did to him. Let's just kind of go back to our lives and forget about this. The historical strangeness of the Christian church is that it explodes onto the scene, not on the front end of Jesus' death, but on the back end of it. People in droves start coming to the church in full understanding of all that it was going to cost them. Why? Because they were convinced that this message, this declaration, was true, and it was legit, and it was worth getting in on no matter the cost. And of course, the other strange thing that's going on, that's why we read through the end of the chapter, is you see how it's fundamentally changing their lives, and they're starting to do strange things with their lives. They're practicing radical economic sharing. They're selling their possessions. Some are selling their homes so that they have finances and resources so they can give to poor people and to those who are in need. They're practicing radical hospitality. They're always in one another's homes, and they're breaking bread together and sharing life with each other. And they can't get enough of this word of God from the apostles and the prophets. They can't get enough learning about this new life of following Jesus. Right? So there it is. You got a strange character up front. You got a strange message being proclaimed, and you have this strange result of thousands and thousands of people coming. And here's the thing, right? This, whether you trust the Bible or not, historians, secular or religious, will tell you that, the church exploded after the death of its Messiah. And they would tell you also that it was this strange new life that they were practicing together that started to cause everybody to be curious and to ask questions and to get in on this, and ultimately turn the whole Roman Empire on its head. And again, all I'm doing here this morning is I'm saying all this strangeness, the only thing that explains this strangeness is that there's some truth to this event and there is some truth to this claim. The only reason Luke uses Peter to be the conveyor of the message because that's the way it went down. The only reason Peter is going to stand up amidst all the Jewish authorities and face whatever's coming next, declaring this truth about the resurrection of Jesus, is because he's convinced this is what happens. The only reason 3,000 people are going to forsake whatever's coming at them through aligning to this Messiah who's so ticked off the Jewish authorities and the Roman authorities that they put him to death is because they were convinced through eyewitness encounters, they were convinced through the declaration of the word, they were convinced through the inner testimony of the Spirit, they were convinced through the testimony of the church doing this radical life together that there was something to this, that this is legit, that there is truth in this claim about the resurrection of Jesus. You know, and I would just say to you, speaking personally, this is how it's worked in my own life. How is it that I have come to trust in the Bible and the central claim of the Bible? Well, it's been this combination of the event itself, the word giving testimony to that, being a part of the church ever since I was a child and seeing how this word and this event and the power of the Spirit has changed lives in dramatic ways, and being a part of these people who do strange things and love to come together and serve and be a part of a family together. So it's been the event, the proclamation of the event, the being part of the fellowship of the church, and just then the inner working of the Spirit that has brought this conviction in my heart and my life that there is nothing more true than the resurrection of Jesus. And it's not just me. You go the whole world over. No matter what ethnicity, you go talk to them, whatever language people are coming from, whatever political persuasion they're coming from, you find 2.5 billion people in the world over today who have similarly found this incredible joy, this incredible purpose, this incredible freedom and life and forgiveness through this event that's proclaimed by the Word, testified to by the church, and empowered by the Spirit. There is far more historical evidence, universal, worldwide evidence for the reality of the resurrection than any other historical event, really, in the ancient world. But the bigger point is that there is more than enough evidence for you, no matter where you're coming from, to at least give it a second look and say, you know what, there might be something here worth me investigating. There might be just enough evidence of reliability here that maybe it'd be worth my while to dive into this word a little bit more, to dive into this church community that seems to be changed by this a little bit more, and to pray that the Spirit would somehow sink this truth deep into my heart and my life. As I'm telling you, if you walk down those roads, it has the power to change your whole life. You know, and maybe lastly, I would just say this. Whether at the end of, this summer of asking these questions, and even today asking this question and talking about what I think is the reliability of the resurrection claim, maybe if even at the end of this, you still have a hard time just entrusting yourself to it and believing this. I'm pretty sure that if you're honest with yourself, you want this to be true. Right? Because think about it, if you've been tracking with us through this whole summer, we've asked some really hard questions, and underlying those questions are these passionate desires for justice, passionate desires for, honorable treatment of women. We've talked about that. Or passionate desires to see people from different ethnic groups and different racial backgrounds finding out ways to live in harmony and peace and joy with one another. We talked about that. Or these passionate desires for the relief of those who are suffering. And as we've been talking through these questions and these issues, one thing that I've been sort of pointing out a little bit week by week is that these desires don't just stir up in a vacuum, nor are they universal desires, but these are desires that might be in your heart and mind because you've grown up in a society heavily influenced by Christian values and by the Christian scriptures. Right? These are some radically unique things that the Christian Revolution brought into the world. It wasn't the Roman world and the ancient world that was caring for the poor and the rights of the poor. It was the church. They started selling their possessions so that they could have resources to provide economic justice to those who were suffering, and began to convict and change the whole Roman Empire of that. It wasn't the Roman Empire, as we talked about last week, that was figuring out ways to come and do ethnic harmony, especially between Jew and Gentile. They were struggling with that all along. It was the church that was doing the hard work of figuring out, okay, how are we going to do this? Coming together, live in unity, break bread, people with different ethnic, political, religious backgrounds. Or it wasn't the Roman Empire that was exalting women to positions of respect. All right, we talked about that. It was the Apostle Paul who came in and said to the husbands, hey, you love your wives like you love your own body. You put their needs and their concerns above your own, and you be willing to lay down your life for that. You know, it was the New Testament church that was passionately concerned about those who were suffering and those who didn't have the ability to defend themselves and care for themselves. Why? Because they were convinced that the great new creation, restoration operation had begun in the resurrection of Jesus. Again, which is all to say, I think it's the Christian story that stirs those questions and longings in your heart and your life. And in my mind, it's the Christian story that gives not only the most plausible, but the most effective solution to it that is worth your confidence. That the Creator God would have so much love and commitment, faithfulness to his creation, that he would enter into it and suffer rejection, rebellion, hatred, injustice, the pain of death, so that he could exhaust its power and begin this new restoration project. I think it's the source of your longings. I think it's the best solution that you know in your bones you're craving for this healing from the problem of death. And so the invitation for you this morning is to consider its reliability. Consider the event. Consider the word that testifies to it. Consider the testimony of the true church all and down through the ages, the testimony of their changed lives, and pray that the Spirit might show you. The Spirit that was enabling people to speak in different tongues to convey this good news, that Spirit would sink that good news deep into your heart, and I think you'll find it'll change your life. It'll flood your life with a hope that you've never known, with a joy, with a confidence that you've never known, a freedom, a forgiveness that you've never known. This cynical world we live in, where it's hard to trust. You know, anybody will tell you, you start losing trust, and everything collapses in on the cells because relationships don't function all that well. And so we collapse everything inside, and there are psychologists and sociologists telling us this is what we've done. We've collapsed life and the world in on ourselves, and that is a crushing identity. It's a crushing burden to bear. And all sorts of people are saying, hey, we got some red flags going up in our culture today, red flags for our future generations. There's a much better way. There is a much greater confidence and security and hope that you can have. There is freedom and joy, identity and purpose, forgiveness, all you can have. And it all centers on this claim. Has Jesus been raised from the dead? And I think there's more than enough reason for you to think that's a reliable claim. Dive into it. Dive into the church. Dive into the Spirit. And you might find him changing your life with it. That's my prayer for you, for all of us. Whether you're on the outside, skeptical looking in, or you've been a lifelong follower of Jesus, that the Spirit would continue to sink the message of the resurrection deep into your heart, lead you into greater joy and greater mission together for his kingdom's sake. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.